So we are on week two. Do we have any new folks here today? Quick show of hands. A couple of you. Okay, thanks for coming today. So we're doing a series called Nourished, and I really wanted to share this series with you all because I wanted us to talk about our health in terms of how do we take care of ourselves when we're going through illness or maybe we're recovering, and just making sure we're kind of hitting the basics, right? And making sure we have the foods that keep us nourished, but also sort of emotionally, mentally, all those things kind of work hand in hand. And so today we're going to be focusing on the heart. So the heart is a very important organ. It's written about in many songs. We're going to be talking a little bit nutritionally after the recipe, but today I want to kind of walk us through a very simple recipe. If you missed last week, there was a great one, but I think Jose shares the recipes with you all online, and there's a recording of that if you want to see that. But thanks for being here today. Today, what we're going to be making is this delicious 2-bean bulgur and herb salad. And there's a lot of great health properties to it. It's not quite summer, although it looks like it. It's kind of deceiving. It's beautifully sunny outside. It's a little chilly, but this recipe can kind of be done any time of the year. I tend to prefer to have it cold, and so some of the things I've done in advance so that we can enjoy it cold today. But I'll walk you through the steps of it. It's a really quick recipe, so we'll talk a little bit about the recipe and then we'll get into some of the nutrition and answer any questions. And if you haven't been in one of my classes before, I do like to try to make this as kind of casual and ask questions along the way. We are here for an hour, so I like to be respectful of your time as well, and try to wrap things up. But yeah, let's dive in. So for our 2-bean and bulgur herb salad, the main ingredient is bulgur wheat. Has anybody used or cooked with that type of grain before? A couple of you. Okay. So it looks like this. It comes in different coarse like sizes. It can be really coarse and large. It can be really small and fine. Depending on the size, I usually tend to do a 2-to-1 ratio. So 2 cups of either water, just plain water, or you could use vegetable stock or any kind of stock that you have on hand, just to give it a little bit of flavor. But experiment with it a little bit because they're all a little bit different. Tend to follow the instructions on the package. You can find it in a lot of places in bulk, and so you might find on the container at the bulk section of the store the proper proportions for cooking it. You can also find this really inexpensive at a lot of these international markets where there's a lot of great places around here where you can find them. But it's a great whole grain because it's kind of like you could use it in place of brown rice. It has a lot of great nutritional properties. So fiber, obviously, because it's a whole grain, meaning it doesn't have all the good stuff taken away from it, right? And then also it's a great source of iron, which for women, as you know, is really important. But one thing we want to do when we're looking at things like iron and all of that is we want to pair it with something like vitamin C to make sure that we absorb the iron a little bit better. So bulgur wheat is one of my favorite things. It doesn't take that long to cook either. So what I did was I basically put it in a pan with a little bit of liquid. So I do kind of, in this recipe, I did part stock and part water. You could do all water. And you basically bring it up to a boil, turn the heat down once it comes to a boil, and you can leave the lid on. Sometimes it'll sputter a little bit, so you can release some of the bubbles that are coming up by lifting the lid a little bit, but just cook it really low. And it takes maybe about 20 minutes, depending on how much you're cooking. So I'll pass this around, though, because I always like you guys to see what ingredients we have in our recipe. Well, let me put my gloves on here. So we're going to start with this cooked bulgur, and I'm making kind of a big batch because we've got a big group today. And then the next thing we're going to do is, one thing I wanted to mention about bulgur. So it is like any grain where, if you're thinking about, especially if you're not feeling well and you're like, I don't have time to cook a lot of things. If anybody does any kind of advanced meal prep or anything, this is a great one because it keeps really well. So it has this nice, small, kind of granular texture, but it cooks up really well. So it's nice and fluffy. Sometimes what I'll also do too is you don't have to rinse it before you cook it like sometimes you do with rice to get rid of that extra starch. But what I like to do sometimes is also add in just a little splash of olive oil while it's cooking, just to kind of get these nice sort of separate grains. So I'm going to break that up a little bit here, but it's nice and chilled, which is going to make this salad really delicious. And then the next thing we're going to do are our green beans. And so green beans, great source of potassium, which is good to help regulate our blood pressure and with the heart. One thing that I did with this, you could use, frozen green beans, canned green beans. I used fresh, and I did a technique that's very simple called blanching. Has anybody done that at home when you've cooked? Yeah, so I recommend this, especially for if you're new to getting a lot of like raw veggies into your diet, or you're having some sort of gastro distress, or just kind of wanting to be a little easy on the digestion. Doing a blanching technique to any kind of vegetable will help kind of make it a little bit easier to digest. So what you do is you basically take, and my apologies, I had my burner, but it wasn't working. So this is already cooked, which is okay. And it's not fully cooked. So what we want is we want a pot of boiling water. I add a little bit of salt. And in the recipe, I said, kosher salt. You could use regular table salt, but that's just to give flavor to whatever you're going to be blanching. So you bring a pot of water with a little bit of salt up to a boil. And then once it's boiling, you drop in your whatever vegetable. And just until it turns that nice bright color. In this case, it's going to be really bright green because we're cooking with green beans. You could do it with broccoli, cauliflower, carrots, things like that. But you just want to cook it maybe just for like 2 to maybe 5, just depending on the size of what you're cooking, 2 to 5 minutes. And it's just to kind of get it just like once you bite into it, it's still tender. It's not fully cooked. That's also another great secret for when you're meal prepping, because this holds really well. You could make a bunch of this, and then when you're ready to enjoy it, you just reheat it, and it still has that great color, has the great texture. So we're going to add in our green beans. A little tricky to do with gloves. Okay, so in go all of my green beans, which I've already taken the stems off. And I hope this will all fit in my bowl here. We're going to find out. Okay, and then the next thing we're going to add are chickpeas. And so I like to do a lot of recipes that are plant protein kind of forward. They're inexpensive, they have great protein, and chickpeas are also great for they are low in cholesterol, right? Obviously. They are low in sodium. If you do find chickpeas in a can and you want to give them a quick rinse before you cook with them, that will also help decrease the sodium, which is good for our heart. So we're just going to take chickpeas and add that in next. Chickpeas, garbanzo, same thing. Try experimenting with different brands, because I do find that there are some that are much more, I'd say, like larger and tender and have more sweetness. This is just a regular store, H-E-B brand. It's just as delicious, but I always like to tell people when you're learning how to cook, or you're kind of a little bored with what you're cooking, try different brands, because they may have just slightly different flavor profiles of a very similar thing. So do that with tomato sauce even, or things that you tend to cook with. Change things up a little bit just by changing the brand. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is tomatoes. And so tomatoes have lycopene, which is great antioxidant, good for our heart. And it also helps lower the what they call the bad cholesterol, which is the LDL cholesterol. So very important. Also has great source of vitamin C. Keeps us healthy, keeps our immune systems healthy, and consequently keeps our hearts nice and healthy. And all I did was I just cut them in half. I don't know if I'm going to fit this all in this bowl. We're going to find out. We're going to find out. Okay, so these I want to just add in as well. And so I always say when you're doing some things with cooking at the beginning, don't rush into it, right? So do it very simply. So I'm just going to cut these in half. Now, I have seen all sorts of videos on how to cut a lot of these very quickly, and I always err on the side of safety. But you can. I've seen a lot of crazy videos. But sometimes people will take, a little handful and hold it with their hand, right? They kind of align them, and then they slice it, right? That's, if you want to be a little, dangerous, and try that. I've also seen people put like a little plastic lid on top and do the same technique so they can go faster. But, part of what we're talking about too when it comes to being nourished is like, enjoying the process of something like this, because it can be enjoyable, right? And we want to take the time. So, doing something like this is not that difficult. A lot of things come pre-cut at the store these days. Yesterday I was at HEB and there was a young man, I think he was shopping with his mother, but she was on the phone. And he was in the aisle kind of she was telling him what to buy. And he was in the aisle that had all of the pre-chopped like onions and things like that. And I thought, this is great. I mean, I have no judgment for people who just don't have the time and that's an easy thing. You're going to pay a little bit more sometimes when things are already pre-processed like that, right? But if it means that you're cooking something for yourself, from scratch, by all means. So I thought it was kind of cute that they were sort of shopping together and they were going to make something with something that was already prepared. And I was like, great. I was kind of curious what they were going to make. I almost stopped to ask him, but I didn't want to sort of photobomb his video call with his mom. So okay, so I'm just going to chop the rest of these tomatoes. And yeah, this recipe has been kind of one of my favorites. It's very similar to, has anybody enjoyed a salad? It's kind of a Middle Eastern salad called tabbouleh. Yes. Yeah, so that's a great one. Very heavy on the parsley, regular curly parsley. Today we're using Italian parsley, and then it has that bulgur in it. And lots of citrus, so lemon. There might be maybe sometimes some onion, but typically it's very simple, and then it just gets dressed with a little oil and probably just salt and pepper. That is one of my favorite salads, and so I kind of took inspiration from that. A lot of the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern food diet is very healthy because there are a lot of grains and fruits and vegetables in that. And that's never a bad thing, right? So I tend to eat that way a lot. One, it makes the recipes that you make very simple. I might need that, thank you. It's almost Thanksgiving. So I might be able to make it work, but that's probably easier, thank you. Okay. So, okay, a couple more things. That's actually everything as far as what we're gonna chop that's large. The next couple of things are just some fresh herbs. And so, does anybody here have a garden? Nobody? Okay, a couple, okay, yeah. So if you're able to grow any of this stuff, I highly recommend it, but you can always find it at the grocery store. We're gonna add in this Italian parsley that I was talking about, and then some fresh dill, which is one of my favorite things. Now, if you couldn't find fresh dill, obviously you could use dry. It's just not gonna have as sort of that bold flavor of the fresh herbs. With dill, it was crazy. I was trying to track down the best looking dill and they were out of stock. So I went back to the store the next day and they had some, but I take a look at like, any of these yellow fronds on here, I don't want to use, but this is okay. So I'm just going to kind of go through this because I bought a couple of packs and I want to make sure we use the good stuff. But yeah, and I'm just going to I'll kind of hold it all together and then remove the stems. You don't want to use the stems of this, although, they're kind of delicate enough. Maybe you could use it. I always say try to use things in other stuff when you're cooking. So maybe you could cook your bulgur with a little bit of the, the leftover fronds and the stems, and that'll infuse the flavor of that in your bulgur. Okay, so we're just going to rough chop our dill. And I just keep it in this nice little bunch and just run my knife through and then just give one more pass through a couple times. And just the smell of that is beautiful. Reminds me of canned pickles, This is the joy of cooking, right? Like all the smells, the memories. It's great. Okay. So we're going to add that. And it's just a beautiful color. I mean, it's kind of Christmas colors, right? We got some red, we got some green. And then for the parsley, I'm going to do the same thing. Now, you could, if you wanted to sort of be in your Zen moment, just go through each one individually, but we don't have time for that today. So we are going to just do a simple, kind of hang on to this bunch here. And I'm just going to cut down at the base and remove all my stems. There's a very fancy technique that I learned in school where you take a very sharp knife and you just kind of shave the leaves off the stem. It takes a little bit of practice to get it right. You still get some stems in there every now and then, but I find this is just as easy.
What's the difference in the two parts?
That is a great question. So this is Italian parsley, and it tends to have sort of more of a flatter, larger leaf like that. I tend to find the flavor of this a little more pleasing for my appetite and my palate. Curly parsley is that really nice curly, green parsley. It tastes similar. You could use either one. I often think just because I've cooked so much that that's sort of the garnish or the decorative parsley, but you can use it too. I just have always used Italian parsley because I prefer the flavor, but they're kind of interchangeable. Yeah. Has anybody cooked with Italian parsley before? Or you tend to, if you're using a fresh herb? Yeah. I find, I think I mentioned in one of the past classes, like I love eating meals that have lots of variety and color, but just a regular green leaf salad doesn't always do it for me unless there's a lot of textures and things in there, right, that make it a little more interesting. And so when I say salad, people kind of are like, oh, salad, right? And I'm like, no, but wait, this is a different kind of salad because there's no lettuce in here, right? But there's just as many textures and flavors that are going to make this really delicious. And I want to kind of break this down just a little bit so that we're not getting big chunks of the parsley. And this smells great too. Now, if you're not used to using fresh herbs, it might be a little strong, so maybe you don't want to use as much. But we've got a pretty big batch here, so we're going to add as much. This is about two good-sized bunches. I'm going to put this in here until I have to mix it, because the last thing we're going to add is just our oil. So let me just clean up our board here. Yeah, some of these salads are just so simple and they come together really well and fairly quickly, and they keep pretty well. So I might do something like this on a Sunday and then enjoy it for the rest of the week. The other thing I might do is actually use it as something to top a regular green salad. So I'm getting additional fiber, right? Additional greens. You could do that as well. It works really well that way. Okay, I'm just switching my gloves. I always say 2 of my least favorite things to do in cooking are chopping garlic, peeling the garlic and chopping it, and parsley, because it gets everywhere, right? So I'm gonna just switch my gloves because that's my little pet peeve. But the last things we're gonna add are just some fresh lemon, and we're gonna use both the zest and the juice. So I'm gonna add this into here. Where's my spoon? Look at all these beautiful colors. I mean, that's gorgeous. Okay, now you can see it all. I don't know, Jose. We'll have to do 2 batches. You're like, there's going to be a lot of people, so we're making a lot. This is a great one to do. I mean, this is a great one for any of the holidays that are coming up, right? Something a little bit different, kind of unique. We're used to kind of seeing the typical, root vegetable kind of salads, which are just as delicious. I might get in here with my hands because I gotta have gloves on, and that would be fun. So, okay, so we're gonna do the lemon, and I've already washed these. And the trick with this is just, don't go down too far to get to that white pith because that's too bitter. So we're just zesting the surface of this lemon, and I'm gonna do this with all 3. And then we're going to juice them as well. And I'm kind of working my way around any of the blemishes on this lemon too, because I don't want anything to detract from the delicious taste of this. Citrus, again, great vitamin C, keeps us healthy. We're coming up on winter, right? So a lot of the flu and cold season, so we want to make sure that we're using all of the things that we can to keep ourselves healthy, and vitamin C is an easy one. I've often said though too, because people think of citrus as the go-to vitamin C, but greens are just as loaded. Things like broccoli, dark leafy greens are a great source of vitamin C as well. This smells so great, you guys. And this is obviously one of those salads too, like everything here is already chilled, but it's one where if you chill it for at least an hour, I'd say it helps marry all those flavors together. So you'll get a sense of the deliciousness of this salad, but the longer it sits, the more those flavors come together. So I'm just going to cut these in half so I can juice all of these. Oop, roll away lemon. Okay. What do you guys think of this recipe so far? Pretty easy, right? Yeah. I love that we're putting it in a roasting pan too. Oh, I think this will work. That's funny. You're going to come with like larger and larger containers. So Jose mentioned, I always check with her. I'm like, how many people are coming? I'm like, okay. And then I was like, no, I don't think so. I think we need a little more. You're going to want to try this salad, and it's great. You know, who here is kind of more of a savory person for breakfast instead of kind of having the typical sweet, you know? I think this is a great one. I really always tout the virtues of the nutritional virtues of bulgur, because it is one of those whole grains that can kind of go either way. You could turn it into almost like an oatmeal, and because it has a nice nutty flavor, you could toast it and then cook it like I did, and then add all sorts of, you know, dried fruits, some nuts, make it like an oatmeal. If you have a little slow cooker and you wanted to, you know, make some in the morning before you get ready for work, this is a great one. It can be used in both applications. Nutritionally, you put me on the spot. I'd have to look it up, but I would say, I mean, because we did a recipe not too long ago with farro. That's also one of my favorite whole grains. There's just a lot, because it's one of the natural whole grains. It hasn't had all of the good stuff stripped from it. I mean, they're both right up there. Great source of protein, great source of fiber. Be careful though, because those are things that, you know, they're great sources of fiber, so that obviously they're helping to sort of expand and make you feel full. But if you're not used to that, I always recommend people do things in smaller portions. Farro is kind of one of those, just because of, you know, it's a larger grain. This is a little easier because it's so small. But yeah, they're both really great in nutritional value.
I have a question. What about quinoa?
Quinoa would be great in here as well. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we've got some salt and pepper, and then the last thing we're going to do is our olive oil. And I'm just going to add in, just if you were doing your regular recipe, it's just a 1/4 cup. But since we're tripling this, so everybody has a chance to enjoy. And this is, you know, obviously we talked about olive oil and healthy fats. We're going to be talking in a minute about the types of fats that are good for our heart. And just some interesting new things that I've come across in just a lot of the reading that I do about nutrition on a day-to-day. In our nutrition, I always like to kind of send you all with just some good, you know, references for reading and listening. I'm going to add some salt, and I'm going to just test this before I add all of this in. A little bit of black pepper. But you could add any kind of herb to this, but we're keeping it pretty simple because, again, the goal is to make something that's simple but nourishing and not take too much time to prepare it, right? I think I'm going to get in here with my hands because that is the best way to do it. Okay. And that way we get a little bit of everything dispersed in here. And so we want to make sure we get all of the herbs that are on the bottom blended in. It's like we're making a Thanksgiving meal right here. And once I mix this all up, I'm going to hand it over to Jose, and she's going to dish out for us. And we'll move into our nutrition. Any other questions while I'm just kind of pulling this together?
Where did you find the fresh dill?
H-E-B. I did have to go to the H-E-B twice because they were out of stock. I was like, nope, it's got to be fresh dill for this recipe. But yeah, H-E-B has it.
Which one?
I go to the one, I'm kind of on the south end of town, but it can be, yeah. I think fresh dill, you know what I did notice though? They changed the brand of their fresh herbs. And so they still carry two different kinds, but this is one called, I think it's called SOL, Soul. They tend to be, I think, well, everything now is expensive, right, at H-E-B, unfortunately. Add a little bit more salt.
So Alibaba on Woodstock, next to Pasha restaurant, they have the dill bunch for $1.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's, I mean, if you can find stores like that, if you're close to that, they have great prices on all sorts of just regular produce ingredients, but just some of this cool stuff that I love cooking with. And I think it's fun too to just kind of see if you're that kind of person who really enjoys kind of seeing all the different ingredients like I do. Check out these stores because they have some wonderful things. And then I always ask questions about like if I'm not sure about something in one of those stores, I'd ask somebody like, how would you use this? And I get some great recipe suggestions for that. So, okay, Jose, I think we are good.
That's beautiful.
It is beautiful, right? Okay. And sometimes it is fun to just get in there with your hands. So I'm going to pass that around. And then we will move on to our nutrition while Jose is doing that. But glad you all enjoyed that. It is a very quick recipe. The only things you have to do are cook that bulgur and then blanch your beans. If you didn't want to blanch the beans, you could just quick microwave some, right? Or just put them in a pot, cook them, and then away you go. Okay, so when it comes to the heart, some of the things that are important, and you may all have heard a lot of these, so they may not be new to you, but they're important. And so we want to talk about fats. Basically two types of fats. There's saturated and unsaturated. And the easy way to remember that is saturated are the ones that are solid at room temperature. So if you think about things like butter, lard, shortening, anything like that that's solid at room temperature, those are saturated fats. Monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats are known as the good fats. So they help the brain function more efficiently. They help us lower the risk of heart disease and stroke by reducing that bad LDL cholesterol. So some examples, because you hear these terms thrown around and sometimes it's hard to remember, but I always try to associate it with what actually are they? What foods can we find them in? Examples of monounsaturated fats include salmon. I know we were having a fun discussion about salmon last week. Olive oil, which we used in this recipe today. Avocados, which are everybody's favorites, I think. Peanut butter, because that's an easy go-to, right? And then all sorts of nuts and seeds like almonds, pecans, and pumpkin seeds. Polyunsaturated fats can be found in things like canola oil, walnuts, and flax seeds, which we used a lot of that in the last recipe last week, and then sunflower seeds and tofu. So remember that as you're going out and building your recipes, your meals for the week. Monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, those unsaturated fats are the ones that are good for our heart. The saturated fats are more, like I said, they're solid at room temperature. They typically come from animal sources, so meat and dairy, which are delicious foods. And if you can enjoy those foods, go ahead. But one of the things that we want to talk about when it comes to saturated fats is, one, they tend to be higher in calories, and so that can contribute to weight gain and possibly an increase in that bad LDL cholesterol, which then affects one's risk of heart disease or stroke. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But the third type of fat is trans fats, or partially hydrogenated oils, that come from also animal food sources, or they can be artificial. So think about things that like deep fried foods, baked goods. These are the types of fats that, again, raise your bad LDL and actually lower your good HDL cholesterol. And think about things that they're like found in foods that help keep them more shelf stable. So it's all kind of those vegetable shortening things, maybe margarine, stuff like that. Does anybody do that as kind of a natural practice of just kind of turning the package around and seeing what's on the back? Yeah. That has been those nutrition labels have been updated over the years, and there's a lot of great information on there. And if you spend a little time just kind of familiarizing yourself with the information, it's a really helpful and great resource to be able to make choices about the foods that we're putting in our shopping cart and in our meals, right? And so one thing I like to stress is that, during our illness and recovery, our appetite is going to change. And so when we're in a deficit of calories, it's really important and really critical to lean towards healthy sources of fat. So all of these that we talked about in the beginning here, because they not only provide those feelings of like feeling full, right? But they also give us that energy and that extra strength to get through our recovery. And so that's really, really important. Maybe you're taking some medications or you're going through some treatments that also affect your appetite. And so, again, really critical to make sure that you're finding and you're choosing some of those healthier ingredients in your foods to make sure that you have the nourishment that you need. Now, two other things about the heart and nutrition. Sodium. So for many years, we've heard, right, about sodium. We do need it in our bodies and in our diets because without it, we can suffer from things like muscle weakness, confusion, headaches, maybe vomiting. If your sodium is too low, you can have a lot of these symptoms, and it's pretty scary. It can be very severe, especially in older people. My mother had that happen, actually, ended up in the hospital and had to take these really crazy salt pills, and that was not fun for her. So stay hydrated and make sure that you're finding, sodium in your food, but not too much, because the opposite effect of having too much sodium is that it can cause the body to retain fluids, and then that causes an increase in our blood pressure and puts us at risk for long-term heart disease. So this is sort of a recommendation. It's always based on just kind of like a 200 calorie diet. But if you think about 5% of our daily value of sodium, that's all we need. And that really equates to just about a quarter teaspoon. That's not very much. But if you think about, again, all the foods that we consume, if you're cooking a lot of your food at home, you can control the amount of sodium. But if you're eating out at a restaurant or you're purchasing products that have sodium, and it's sometimes it's inevitable, like it's always going to be there, but that's why it's really good to educate yourselves. Look at the back of the packages of foods that you're purchasing so that you can see how much sodium is in there. Things like we talked about with the beans, you can do something as simple as rinsing things to cut down on the sodium for some ingredients that are canned. And the last thing is sugar. So, sugar, we've always heard, is not really great for our diet, but it's now even more heavily being scrutinized as being not so great for our diet because of the inflammation properties. And that over time can really weaken the blood vessels and cause some issues with our heart. And so that's why there's been recently, I feel like, a lot more conversation and dialogue about, let's not just think that saturated fats are what's clogging our arteries and making our heart bad. It's also all these other things in combination, and sugar is one of those. So as a general guideline, I always think it is interesting. So women, we can only have 6 teaspoons of sugar. Men, you can have 9. And look for 10% or less added sugars on nutrition fact labels. Yeah, it doesn't seem like a lot, right? But it adds up very quickly in things, either if you're baking or you're going out to enjoy something. And, I think the different kinds of sugar are always sugar. Like the recipe we made last week, I used maple syrup, for example, right? It is still a sugar, so that's counting towards your daily, amount. So, if there are even things like yogurt, milk, and that has natural sugars in it, that's okay, but it is contributing to your amount. So you just have to kind of be careful with, if you're sensitive or you're diabetic, especially, right? We have to make sure that we're monitoring that for our health. So one of the things I wanted to point out, on the bottom left, I recently came across a very interesting podcast with a gentleman. He's a heart surgeon named Dr. Philip Ovadia. And he wrote a book called Stay Off My Operating Table. And I'm always a firm believer in people who've actually experienced something health-wise and then they live to tell about it, right? And so he struggled for many years with a lot of issues, and he's a heart surgeon. And so he wrote this book, and he started to really dig deep into what I was just talking about with, everybody has said or blamed things like saturated fat for the main number one cause of heart disease. Women, we do have to be careful because it is the number one thing that affects women is heart disease and heart attacks and stroke. But he has a podcast and a website called ifixhearts.com, and he has this great book. Highly recommend you give it a listen. But he just has some really good practical, factual information about sugar, and diet. I don't tend to prescribe any particular diet for people when it comes to anybody's individual health, because it is individual, and you all, it's important that you pay attention to your body so that you know when things are off and how to correct them, right? But I like it when professionals who have gone through something that is, lived experience, have some credible information to contribute to the conversation or the ongoing conversation around our health. So he's a good one. The other one, has anybody heard of Dan Buettner? So the Blue Zones and the Blue Zone diet. So I think maybe about a year or two ago, there was a documentary that he put together on Netflix, I believe. And it was called Live to 100, Secrets of the Blue Zone. So he worked for many years with National Geographic doing all sorts of cool stuff. Like if you could read his bio, he's amazing. But basically he studied people all over the world and looked at areas of what was helping people stay healthy longer. Was it their diet? Was it their environment? Was it how they were connected to, people in their environment? Like all of these different factors. And he came up with not only the documentary, and he's got a website, he's got, meals that he does now called the Blue Zone Kitchen. He's got a cookbook as well. But I just love the idea of, people all over the world have been living forever. Obviously, they don't suffer from things like heart disease, stroke, diabetes. And it's curious because some of it obviously has to do with their diet, but also genetic makeup, where they're at. But it's fascinating to study some of those things. And so he has a lot of information that is based on nutrition, which I appreciate. So to take a look at him as well. And then lastly, so I always like to kind of incorporate things that are not always nutrition based. We've got kind of the basics around nutrition, right? But we also want to think about other things that can keep our heart healthy. And one of the biggest things I think, especially as we're going through a period of illness, is connection. So I think the tendency often is when we're diagnosed with something or we're experiencing something that's scary, uncertain, we tend to isolate. We don't want to talk about it. It's not been something in our culture that we're, more open to sharing. And that I think is probably the number one thing that prevents healing faster, because you need the support, right? You need a support system. So I love that you all come together and gather in classes like this because you have the support. But it is true that there was a stat that I read, there's a 50% survival rate in patients who have the support of a caring network. Like even if it's just a couple of friends that you can lean on. And sometimes it's just having somebody to have an ear to listen, right? Like maybe you're just going through a period and you just need someone to talk to and just talk it out. I definitely feel like when we keep all of that in, that also affects our health. That can affect our health, not just emotionally, our mental health, but it affects us physically. It pulls us down. It provides this additional strain on our bodies physically because we don't feel great, and we can't sort of release that pent up energy of just all these emotions that we're going through. So having a social connection is really, really critical. And then the last thing, I feel like we often don't talk about this part enough too, is creativity, right? Last week we were talking about music and how that's just good for the soul, but I think creativity is right up there too. So if you think about things that make your heart happy, they can come through all sorts of creative endeavors. So it can be something like, maybe you're into crafting or gardening or, singing, dancing, cooking, any of those kind of fun things that just lift your spirits. And I think even if you're maybe, I think about people who maybe aren't mobile and they can't do some physical things for a while, or their life changes with whatever diagnosis they have, and they just have to make a lot of big life changes physically. Finding creative pursuits is so important. Or even picking up a hobby that you haven't had before, using your brain in a different way, flexing your creative muscles in a different way is really healthy. Are there any things that you all do, aside from showing up for a Saturday class, that kind of help you work through, periods when you've been dealing with some things, recovery from, illness and things like that, or recommendations for family members who've been through something?
I like to paint rocks.
Oh,
I
yes.
use acrylic paint, and I paint wood. Any kind of pieces. I go to the dollar tree.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
those pieces, I put calm music in the background, and I do that.
Now, do you do anything with the rocks afterwards?
I put it in the park and somebody can find it.
Yes.
And,
Yeah, I love that. I've had a group of friends that I do hiking activities with, and they've started this where they get together and they paint rocks and then they leave them in places. And I just think that's so special because it is like they do the whole thing. They, have a little meal together, drink some wine, have some music, but then they leave it for other people to find. And I think that's, just something simple like that. You stumble upon something really creative or beautiful that somebody's done and left there.
When you are walking, you can see something pretty. Say, oh, look at that. And you can just keep it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, think about those things. If there's anything that you do now, make the time for it because it does give you that extra boost of energy that you may need during this time when you're going through an illness. I really do feel like that it is something so simple. Sometimes it does take a lot of, energy to kind of do something. I do obviously cooking, but photography was one of my past hobbies. And, it takes a while to set up everything. But when I'm in it and I'm doing it, I have my music playing, like I really enjoy that. And it's like a boost of, energy for days when you really do something that you enjoy. So that keeps our hearts happy too. And so think about all of those things, not just the nutrition pieces, but all of those things that kind of help keep us strong, keep our minds mentally positive. That's what we need during this time, right? So that's what I have for you all today. What do you all think of the salad? I know it kind of came together a little quicker. Delicious. All right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think, did everybody get a little sample of it?
Yes.
We've got more. Yeah, and it's very simple. Like I mentioned, if you want to let it chill for, 30 minutes to an hour after you make it, or make some of these parts the day before, do it in stages. This is another thing I always recommend. If you're tired, end of the day, and you're like, I just don't have the energy, Raquel, do it in stages, break it up. That's why I try to keep the recipes to not so many ingredients. And if you didn't want to use fresh dill and you're like, I can't find it, use dried dill. Change up the spices. What's something that you might change in here or add to this recipe?
Peas. You got peas?
Peas, yes.
Could you add some olives?
Olives would be great. Yeah. One thing that I sometimes make with the salad is avocado. I'll throw some avocado in there as well. That just adds additional healthy nutrients in there, right? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming today. Next week, we're going to be focusing on the lungs. So we've got a great, I'm kind of hoping it's a great day for that. We have a delicious roasted tomato soup that we'll be making for next week. So come for that one next week. All right. Thank you so much.